Breitbart News Daily with Alex Marlow. Senator Tom Cotton, Republican from Arkansas, joins me. He's also the author of Sacred Duty, A Soldier's Tour at Arlington National Cemetery, which is a good book, and you guys will enjoy it if you pick it up. We also did about 40-minute interview on it that you can find at Breitbart.com if you want to hunt that down. It's enjoyable. Senator, great to have you on. I want to speak with you about your No Bailouts for Illegal Aliens Act, but before we get to that, the last time you were on the show, you talked about how you had a theory, or you believed you had information that suggested that China had deliberately let the virus spread beyond its borders so that the world could share in its economic downfall, basically, so to sort of disperse the effect of the Corona-19 or the coronavirus COVID-19. And this is you're the first person, I think, that I heard express this, and now I think everyone's kind of expressed it. And so, again, you were well ahead of everyone on this. I haven't seen any pushback to this, and I want to know if that theory is developed or if you have more information on it or where we stand on that, because you were the first person. The first time I heard it was this show, and now everyone's on that story.
Yeah, you really only have to follow the inherent logic of events and understand communists in the way they operate, Alex. So it's clear now that by mid-December, probably early December, the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing understood that this was a highly contagious virus and for many very deadly. And they certainly understood the dramatic impact it would have on their economy. And the last thing they would be willing to tolerate is the collapse of the Chinese economy, which has been the source of their legitimacy and their rise over the last 30 years, while the rest of the world suffered nothing more than a mild recession or perhaps a slowdown in growth, but continued growth. And that's why, even after 5 million people left Wuhan, they continued to allow international flights out of China into the United States, into Europe, into the rest of the world, and continue to insist all the way through January that this disease was not transmissible from persons to persons. They made the deliberate and calculated decision based on the knowledge we now know they had and the flight patterns that were conducted to allow this virus to escape their borders. If their economy was going to collapse, they wanted to make sure that the world economy collapsed so they did not face a relative decrease in their power. I don't think there's much question about that at all.
Yeah, and it's interesting because now they're uniquely positioned to increase their power despite unleashing pandemic and economic crisis on the entire planet, because as countries turn to bailouts, whether it be through infrastructure or even medicine or certainly cash, a lot of them turn to China, and that's an amazing thing.
Yeah, and one just immediate example of that kind of predatory mercantilism is we now know that they also spent much of January stockpiling personal protective equipment from other countries, bringing it in part for their own people, but also in part so they could use it as leverage for the rest of the world. You know, they've insisted that heads of state go to airports and kowtow in front of Chinese airplanes bringing in personal protective equipment. In some cases, they've said if you want this equipment, you've got to agree to put Huawei in your telecommunications system. Now, one reason they do that is we're increasingly seeing how much of the Chinese manufactured equipment turns out to be defective junk, just like so much of what China makes.
Yeah.
But as you say, they're also trying to use financial leverage against weaker, poorer countries to put them even deeper in debt to China.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And there's a lot of China headlines out there today, but I did want to get your thoughts on something that I think has been pretty underreported, which is there's been a lot of nations calling for independent probes, headed up by Australia has been the most vocal on this, into the origins of the virus. And it seems like China is trying to hijack it. China is basically acting as though they're going to go along with it. It just seems like they're playing 3D chess on this one, but I want to get your thoughts.
Yeah, so Australia has been very good in joining us in calling for a probe into the exact origins of this virus. Right now, all the evidence we have points towards the labs in Wuhan, not to the food market in Wuhan. And Australia has paid the price for that. China has retaliated against Australia on trade matters. And that's why we ought to stand with our friends, the Aussies, to ensure that they understand that we're with them and have their back. Even if China says they want to participate in some kind of investigation like that, you can be confident that China is going to do everything they can to influence it, to bias its conclusions, and to ultimately hide Chinese culpability. I mean, we saw this just a few weeks ago with the European Union report that was criticizing China for efforts to sow disinformation about where the virus originated. That was in draft form. And then in the final form, it had significantly toned down those criticisms, again, all because of Chinese pressure and influence behind the scenes.
Certainly. Again, Senator Tom Cotton is my guest talking about the coronavirus and the fallout. And let's talk a little bit about what more that can be done in order to hold China accountable. Are you satisfied with where the conversation is going, or is it time to start talking a little less and acting a little more?
So the administration has taken several steps, and I commend them for those steps. So just last week, for instance, they finalized the rule that would prevent semiconductor manufacturers from using American technology to sell to China. That's not directly related to the virus, but it's long overdue, and it was vitally needed. There are many more measures, though, some related to the virus, like onshoring our pharmaceutical manufacturing through use of incentives and also bans on Chinese imports. Some of them are like the semiconductor issue are just long overdue, and we ought to do them quickly. So, for instance, I think we ought to provide more incentives for making semiconductors here in the United States, just like the world's largest manufacturer last week announced a $12 billion investment in Arizona. We should do more of that. We should make sure that we're not training Chinese students at the graduate and postdoc level in our most advanced laboratories in the most cutting-edge scientific and technological fields. We ought to do things like shut down Confucius Institutes on college campuses, which are really just outposts of Chinese influence and espionage. We ought to invest tens of billions of dollars more in our military for the kind of mid-range missiles and submarines and stealth bombers and fighters that we can position in the Western Pacific to deter Chinese aggression against our allies. I could go on and on, Alex, but suffice it to say there is many, many steps that we need to take to fundamentally reorient our relationship with this communist Chinese regime.
Yeah, I love all those ideas. Maybe I could convince you to do an opinion piece for Breitbart at one point to relay some of those out, because we should have a running tally, because it's going to take years and years to get all this stuff accomplished. So, but we got to start, and it seems like we are starting, which is good news. Unfortunately, a lot of the byproducts of the virus are don't get enough attention, and we have these surreal things that are happening. Like, for example, illegal aliens are getting bailouts in certain parts of the country. In California, we talked about this quite a bit on the broadcast earlier in the week. In particular, comes to mind, and so you want to address this with your No Bailouts for Illegal Aliens Act, a piece of legislation that I can't believe needs to exist, yet it does. Can you talk to us about it?
Yeah, it is pretty remarkable that states like California, who are coming to the federal government and pleading for billions of dollars in no strings attached bailouts, in the next breath, are giving money to illegal immigrants, money that should be going to American citizens, to workers and families who are distressed, or small businesses who are at risk of closure. So I propose legislation, and if there's any additional spending bill, I expect it to be a part of that bill that says that states cannot provide those funds to illegal immigrants. We ought not be giving our hardworking taxpayers money to foreigners who are in this country illegally in violation of our immigration laws. That money ought to be going back to those hardworking taxpayers in this time of grave need.
And going big picture, I think that a lot of us who like federalism and like states' rights are concerned that we've got this domino effect that's taking place, that these states are failing. Some of the states, even though they're failing and they can't balance a budget or even come close to it, they want to give out handouts to illegal aliens, for example, and then they're going to turn to the federal government for a bailout again, which is in massive amounts of debt as well. And then before you know it, it just doesn't seem like we have any states at all, just all one big federal government. And that really, I think, we'll lose something as a country if that's how it goes.
Well, unfortunately, the states are already too dependent on the federal government for a large source of their funds, and we ought to try to move away to that model to the extent we can and let the states be what they are, sovereign governments. that conduct their affairs inside their borders in the way they choose. Now, obviously, they have to acknowledge the supremacy of federal law. They can't not do things like set up sanctuary cities where they intentionally thwart the enforcement of immigration laws. But because the federal government already provides so much money to the states, oftentimes federal government tries to dictate those terms to the states. But as long as we are providing that money, we cannot allow them to use money for foreigners who are here in violation of our immigration laws as opposed to their own citizens.
Are you getting any pushback on this bill, or is it something that people are mostly embracing?
Well, obviously, the open borders Democrats don't like the legislation, but in the end, they have to recognize that Donald Trump's the president and Republicans control the Senate, and if there's going to be any future legislation, I expect this is going to be something on which they're going to have to give.
How about the more establishment Republicans? Are they in line on this, or are you getting pushback there too?
They might acquiesce to it, even if they don't want to celebrate it. No, Republicans are a lot of Republicans, in my opinion, don't see the downsides of mass immigration, especially mass unskilled and low-skilled immigration on working Americans, especially at a time when 35 million people are out of work. But when it comes to giving money to illegal immigrants in the form of government handouts, I think pretty much every Republican agrees that we shouldn't be doing that.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see also what happens with visas, given the unemployment rate being what it is. We can talk about that at a later date. I want to spend the remaining couple of minutes we have on your thoughts on the reopening of America. Again, Senator Tom Cotton, Arkansas, is here. Sacred Duty is his book, which you should all pick up. But let's talk about reopening America. Give me your evaluation of where we are and some steps you'd like to see.
Well, America is reopening. Now, all 50 states are at some stage of reopening or not. Obviously, some are moving faster than others. Those states that didn't have the virus hit them quite so hard, that's reasonable and understandable. It's that same federalist principle we were talking about earlier, Alex, that governors and their legislatures and even local governments ought to be able to adopt the approach that is best for them. What's right for New York City is obviously not right for Kansas City, and neither one of those are right for Star City, Arkansas. So we need to move forward as quickly as we can to get people back on their feet, working in their normal patterns as shoppers and consumers, so we can get the economy moving again. Now, we have to do that in a prudent and sensible fashion. We don't want to see a large surge of the virus, but, right now things are looking pretty good. If you look at the states that moved a little earlier, like Georgia, they have not seen a surge in the virus. Likewise, if you look overseas to countries that moved earlier because the virus hit them earlier, like Austria or the Czech Republic or Denmark, they've been able to continue to reopen more and more parts of their economy without having a big surge in the virus. So I think that's all great news. Everyone obviously needs to exercise caution, and if they're at risk, if they're elderly or if they have underlying condition, they need to exercise extreme caution when it comes to washing their hands and keeping their distance in public and not touching their face. But right now, I think what we're seeing is pretty promising.
I think it is too in many cases, but in other cases, I'm concerned about the politics that seem to be infecting this debate. The lead story right now, Breitbart, is the Democrat National Committee Chairman Tom Perez saying the president's stealing the election by not allowing mandatory vote by mail. I wanted to get your reaction to this and your thoughts on this push to sort of politicize the virus to try to get to make our voter laws more lax.
Yeah, it's all Democratic hysterics over at the DNC, but that's not surprising. Look, there's been lots of false predictions about this virus, and especially about the policy responses to it now for 2 months. Do you remember in early April, there was a demand that Wisconsin cancel its primary or go to all-mail voting? That didn't happen. There are predictions that tens of thousands of people were going to die from standing in line at voting places. That obviously hasn't happened. To my knowledge, there's been no evidence linking that primary election in Wisconsin to any surge in cases. States ought to be able to conduct the elections as they see fit. We ought not allow the Democratic Party to use this pandemic as a time to fulfill their wish list of same-day registration, of all-mail voting, of ballot harvesting that creates the kind of fraud that we've seen in places like California and North Carolina. We have to protect the integrity of our elections, especially in the middle of a pandemic.
Senator Tom Cotton, thank you so much for joining me on the show, and we hope to have you back.